Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Easy Conversations, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I sit down with Curtis Blind, who shares his experience of growing up in residential school in Saskatchewan. Some of the stories Curtis shares are very difficult to hear, and I just want to caution the listeners. While Curtis shares a lot of difficult stories, he also mentioned to me that not everything was all bad about residential schools. However, I wanted to use this as an opportunity and bring Curtis on as a guest so he can share the inside perspective of what it was like growing up in a residential school. Personally, I never knew all the details. I mean, I've heard about residential schools, but I was very ignorant to a lot of the things that happen, and especially in the Indigenous culture. And I wanted to bring awareness for other people as well. I hope you can get a lot out of this episode. I really did. And if you could leave a review at the end, I would truly appreciate it.
All right, Curtis. Well, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining. I'm super grateful for you taking the time today. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and I've approached you a few
Yeah.
times. But again, I really appreciate you doing this and me. But before we get started on the topic we want to cover today, I want to give an opportunity for you to introduce yourself. Who you are, where you're from, and then we'll kind of get into some of the things we want to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Curtis Blind. I grew up in Central Saskatchewan. I'm from the Gordon's First Nation Reserve outside of Regina there. And that's also where my residential school was actually where I'm from.
Yeah.
I believe in the records it's called Gordon Indian Residential School is what it was called. So anybody that's doing a search or a Google search, that's what they'll find it under.
Yeah.
Um, all schools were notorious, but ours was probably had the most cases
Hmm.
in a specific time, and was the
Right.
last school closed. Um, we're going to talk about maybe my experience, and my experience, of course, is different from maybe somebody the generation before. So we'll just ease into that and
Yeah.
we'll go from there. So I'm going to let you start the conversation. And
Yeah, for sure. And I think we want to touch on residential schools today. And I mean, for most people in Canada, I would say even some Canadians don't fully appreciate the context behind residential schools. So I just I pulled some stuff online, and
Mhm.
just to give people some context, I'm just going to read through some of the information here. But basically, the whole concept of residential schools was kind of came from the European influence that we had in Canada. And these residential schools were sponsored by the government, and
Yes,
they were meant to be religious in
yes,
nature. Essentially, they were created by Christian churches, as well as the Canadian government, to assimilate and convert the Indigenous youth into Canadian society. Unfortunately, these schools disrupted lives and communities, and it's caused long-term problems amongst the Indigenous population here in Canada. And as you mentioned, a lot of these school obviously these schools are now closed, with the last one being in 1997.
correct.
It's called Grolier Hall. But yeah, I mean, I think for people, we're going to get into the experience here, but there's 150,000 children that attended these residential schools, and unfortunately 6,000 of these children died during their time in these residential schools.
Yeah,
um, and basically this kind of started around 1830, and then, like I said, the last one was shut down in 1997. um, yeah, and I think what they here, I think that's what you mentioned, the Gordon Residential School in Panuki, Saskatchewan?
Panachai.
Panashai. Okay.
Panachai was the town. George Gordon's First Nation was the reserve it was on.
Yeah.
It was a white farming town where we were bused to school as we went to high school because they had the high school.
Right.
The residential school didn't have only went up to grade 6.
Oh, okay.
But in
Okay.
town they had grades 1 through 12.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that kind of gives us some context here, but we fully, like, at least I personally, and I think most listeners wouldn't fully appreciate the experience and the pain that comes with it. And
Yeah.
I guess the initial question I would have is, who decided, and like, say when you were about to go to school, who decided you were going to go to one of these schools, and how were you sent there?
So I was probably one of the last generations sent there. At this point, I think, to my understanding, my parents were going through a divorce, and I was living with my grandmother, I believe, and then they made that decision, and they put me into school, into that school. It wasn't my mother or my father, but I think my grandmother did. And that's how I started being there. That being said, I had a lot of cousins from both sides of my family there, and a lot of relatives who actually worked there when I went there. When I started, which was 1975, was fall of 1975, the government had already handed over. The church was no longer running the show there. We didn't have the priests and the nuns there when I got there. A man by the name of William P. Starr, had taken over, I believe, in 1972. And that's where my journey began. But that is how I started there. If we're going back to the beginning of them, a lot of those kids were taken. They were taken. And just to add to maybe one of the first sentences you got about why they created these schools was, and it might be harsh, but it's true, it was to kill the Indian, to kill the Indian inside of you. You can use the nice word assimilation, and but it was basically to get the savage out of you, because that's how we were viewed.
Right.
Heathens. We weren't Christians. Missionaries came over, and that's how that all started. The government of Canada. I mean, you can go far back as treaties. You can go to any number of ways to find that trail back to the beginning of the residential schools. But those first children were taken. They were not. Their grandmothers did not willingly send them. They went out to I don't know if they were called agents, but they would go out and capture. They would go out and take the kids from the home because this was in their best interest, separating them from their culture. And, that's in an attempt to cause genocide on an entire culture by starting with the children and systematically destroying the Indian inside them.
Right.
Yeah,
and I mean, there's a few questions based on everything you've said. I think, I mean, the idea was, if they can target the children, it would be easier to, like you said, wipe the culture out, and then for future generations, the culture would basically be extinct. That's
absolutely
pretty much the idea. And when you say taken, like, obviously it sounds like the parents, or whether the grandparents were involved, like, they didn't really have a choice in this or a say in the matter. It was just these kids were taken, and that's it. There's no, like.
Yeah, I think even up to as maybe 1940, the kids were still being taken, like just taken. I can't remember what these men and women were called that went into the reserves, some to remote communities, flying in, like just and grabbing the kids and taking them, and just these some of them never heard from those children again, never saw them again. Sometimes some of them, if they were lucky, returned in the summertime when school was over. And but like you said, that number you have, the 6,000 number, dead. Nobody knows where those children are. They don't have graves. They don't have markers. They don't exist. So, but there came a time when, okay, how am I trying to say this now? Once you had that first generation of those kids going, and maybe even the second generation, now that first generation became reliant on this system, and that's all they knew. They were pretty much, this just became a part of the life. I don't think my grandparents went. I don't think my grandparents were ever in there. They were homesteaders, they were farmers. But my parents were both in day school, because there was the day school as well. There was the residential school, but there was also day school, where the kids, like my parents, came and they attended school, but could go home at night. They didn't live there, but we're still under the same thing with the nuns and the priests and that sort of thing. And it didn't lessen the impact it had on their lives, because both my parents were abused. And so I don't know exactly how, if I'm being eloquent enough, how the further generations. I'm trying to think of your original question, for where you said, well, how did you end up there?
Well, no, I think you mentioned your grandma sent you, right? And
Yeah.
I think, I mean, building on that, I guess, the idea was, again, to wipe the culture out. Now,
Yeah.
I obviously there was force and there wasn't a lot of choice, and in some cases there was maybe choice, like in yours.
Yeah, absolutely.
But once you get to the school now, like say now the kids are at the school, now what is happening? What are they doing, or what were they doing in terms of wiping, from their perspective, like the indigenous culture out of you? And you mentioned abuse, but what are we talking about? Like what was that like?
I can only speak to my
absolutely
to my experience.
Yeah.
I know, as far as my aunts, my uncles, my father, my mother, their hair was cut. They were dressed in, like, they did not resemble Native people. Like, they had curls, they had, the look was changed from what people see Native people as. Uniforms, almost. In the early days, there was uniforms. So when I came in 1975, there were still remnants of those uniforms there. So when I first arrived there, the first thing we did was they took our clothes, and we lined up, and there was a room, and a woman. I'm not going to name any names, because I come from here, and a lot of these peoples aren't people that I know.
Yeah.
And I just don't want to cause problems for them.
No, that's fine.
Some of them are not even alive, but their families still are. We would be issued 2 sets of clothes, and your clothes would rotate. Also, you were issued a number. You were given a number. I was given 66. And I was one of them that remained 66 throughout my whole time there. Some kids had different numbers, depending on the level that you were at. There were 3 levels. Juniors, being the youngest kids, 6 to 8 to 9, 9 to 12, intermediates, and then from there you went to become a senior. So first day we get there. Issued the number, issued the clothes. They took your clothes, they washed them, They rolled them up in a bundle with tape, and your number was on it. You didn't have a name. You know, of course they called me Kurt and things like that.
Yeah. What was the why numbers? Like why were like
I
why
think it was easier. I think it was an easier system. Because in the records, I'm not known as 66. I'm known as Kurt. But when they were, there was boxes in this one room, and each little box had a number. So when it was that day to change out your clothes, and then put your dirty clothes in, and then get your new clothes, your new towels, things like that. And I don't know what the schedule is. I can't remember. I think it was every 3 days. Every Wednesday, I think you got a fresh set, and then on the weekend, you never saw your own clothes,
right?
Until you went home, until like Christmas time, or then you got your clothes back and you went home in your clothes. During you would go to, when you got back from school in the afternoon, they would do like a roll call. There you'd be in a big room with your group, intermediate, junior, whatever you might be, and that's how they would call you. They didn't call you by your name. They called you by your number. 66 here, 4 here, that sort of thing. They didn't say Kurt or Bobby or, anything like that. But if they were talking to us individually, they would say, "Hey, Kurt," and that sort of thing. They wouldn't just yell, 66, where are you? Sort of thing.
Yeah.
No. So I think it was just easier to use those numbers as an identifying marker. Like I said, I wasn't cataloged as 66, at least not in the records that I've seen since in anything, any of the records. I don't, because I, at one point, when I was an intermediate or senior, I broke into the records room to see what my record had said, because I'd acted out in a couple of things, and I remember I broke in. And I got quite good at that. So but I don't remember ever being called 66 on the records, and I don't think anything. So for juniors, you had in those days, if you ever look at the schools, they pretty much all had the same blueprint. I don't know if you've looked at any of the pictures.
I mean, I've seen
like a red.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I saw that in the pictures online. Just the red kind of roof and
the red brick building, brick building with the fronts. So there was boys and girls sides. In my school, at least, there was split right down the middle, boys on one side, girls on the other. But on the top in those days, when I first started, is where the juniors were. I was 6 years old in 1975, about to turn 7. So I was 2 years. I was in grade 2, and I keep losing my train of thought, Ferk. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
You would let me. Do you have a question? Maybe that might make it easier.
I guess just to again put it into perspective, like, you're 6, you've been taken to the school now, and essentially, all the kids would stay there, right? Like you said, I mean, you basically live there, and then you may get to go back on Christmas, but you didn't see your family otherwise. All you knew was the teachers.
I did. I was lucky, but I was lucky because the grandmother who sent me there worked there.
Okay.
Yeah, she worked there. My grandfather was the carpenter for the school.
Yeah.
The residential school at this time had become a source of employment for a lot of band members from the band members around.
Right.
So, it's not like I could just skip down and go and see grandma.
Yeah, but I guess for most kids whose family members didn't work there, they essentially didn't see their families.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There was a majority of the kids. Yeah, they came from faraway places. They came from Yeah, hundreds, 200 kilometers away. Some came from Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, you really felt for those kids. Some of those, I remember one kid when we first started could not speak English. He could only speak Soto, which is a type of a native language.
Yeah.
Most of us were Cree there, but he was Soto, and he didn't know. He was just a tiny little guy. I don't even think he was even supposed to be there,
Mm-hmm.
or was old enough to even be there. Yeah, his name was Mervyn. It was just, but you felt for this little kid, man. Like he was, you know,
Yeah.
most of us did not speak Cree at this time. It had already been pretty much drummed out of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my parents both didn't speak Cree, but my grandparents did. So
Yeah.
you can see the generation, how it went, how the assimilation and kill the Indian
Yeah.
was working, how it was successfully working.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I was one of the lucky ones. My father did become a night watchman there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a whole other story, and I don't know if we'll touch on that today. But if we do, um, that's pretty cool because with his experience, of course, it damaged him, both him and my mother, quite a bit. Left their
Yeah.
marks. But they grew up in the time of nuns and priests,
Mm-hmm.
and faced quite violent measures
Yeah.
by that from the hands of them, from the nuns in their
Yeah.
own way. Yeah.
No, and I wanted to
Uh,
touch on that a little bit. Like if you're,
mhm.
you know, if you don't mind sharing, like, you know, you've
I'll
talked
share
about
what I
the,
know.
yeah,
Yeah.
you've talked about the abuse and stuff like that. Like, I guess the two questions I have based on that
Mhm.
is, you know, what kind of abuse was there and why was it there from your understanding?
For me personally, my story,
Yeah, or in
or
general, like what you're aware of, like, you know, because you've mentioned
I
abuse and
don't
like,
know why they were so vicious. I don't know why these Christians. I mean, uh, were so terrible,
mm-hmm,
uh, and beating and doing what they were, but they were quite successful at what they were chosen to do. I don't know if the government hired them specifically, these
mm-hmm,
mean ones, because
mm-hmm.
majority of them were.
Yeah,
As far as I know, I know my dad was, uh, as he put it, this one nun would says she would never miss an opportunity when she walked by my desk and just whack him with one of those, those big yardsticks.
mm-hmm,
Yeah, they walked around with those, and she demean him and call him dummy. And finally, I think Dad only went to grade 2 or 3. I know 6. I think grade 6 he went to,
mm-hmm,
but he was the oldest, and he was a day student, remember, but still exposed to those people as
mm-hmm,
well.
mm-hmm.
Um, my mom, both my parents were the oldest in their families, and when you're the oldest and there's a lot of kids, you eventually were called out to help with the
Yeah,
kids. And
yeah,
dad left. He said, I wasn't learning anything anyways. I was just getting hit all the time. So I just left at grade 6 and went to work with his dad on the homestead.
mm-hmm,
But it definitely left his mark. It left its mark on Dad.
yeah,
Um, he always he would mention it, but yeah. I'm sorry. I'm just thinking about my dad. I just lost him about a year and some ago. So I'm just thinking
yeah,
about Dad.
yeah. No, I'm
Same
sorry.
with my mom. Yeah, same thing. She was left-handed. She was left-handed, and my mom has this reddish tinge to her hair. Now
Mm-hmm,
you put those two together with someone who's a firebrand or a hellfire, and yeah, she was called a witch. They tie her hands behind her back, so she would tie right with the right hand,
mm,
cut her hair, and just cruel,
yeah,
unnecessarily cruel, but I guess necessary to what their ends were, to what they wanted to do, which was
right. So they had an outcome in mind and they used abuse as a form of conformity, right? And
Or
and was it
bad rage.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And was it similar in your case? Like when you were going to school, like was it
Then go
or
ahead. I'm sorry.
or had kind of been toned down like in your generation compared to your
The
parents?
nuns and the priests were gone a few years before I think in 1969 or 1970, they were gone. So when I started in 74, a man had taken over uh, in that respect, and his name was William P. Starr, and
Mm-hmm.
that who would become the administrator for my time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is where the abuse comes into play. Not only with I was going to call him Mr. Starr because that's what we had to address him as. Um, but he was for me and the guys I grew up with. He was what you would call grooming. He would groom us kids, us boys, and I'm just trying to be as clear as I possibly can and not lose my train of thought
Mm-hmm.
because it is very important how he did this. Boys 6, 7, 8. He didn't have full on touching at this point. He was make a game of it, almost a reward system because we were given allowance. I think it was a quarter or 25 cents in there because we also had a canteen, and this canteen also comes back into play in the story. So on Starr had this big desk in his office, and that's where you went to get your allowance and call you out or call your number, and you go up. And anyways, it would feel like it was a game. It was a male figure because a lot of us had absent fathers. A lot of us didn't have a father figure, and we're missing that. So this was our, I don't want to say father, I want to say this was our male figure.
Mm-hmm.
And anyways, this huge desk, 2, 3, 4 boys, because we were small. I got to remember a 6-year-old boy, 7-year-old boy. We're still quite young.
Mm-hmm.
And could fit under this desk, and Starr would make himself hard. And his pants were still on, but he would make it a game. He would bounce his dick in his pants. And you're a kid, so you think this is funny. Oh, look at this. This is, and that was the beginning of the grooming. That was the reward system. Okay, oh, look how fun this is. And then you were getting your 50 cents. You were getting your allowance. So that was the association. As things progressed as you went along, and I'm just going to go into brackets of junior, junior, intermediate, senior. So I was only a junior for I think a year, and I went into intermediates right after that. I want to say, I want to talk about actually, I probably cut in at this point that the people who looked after us, Starr oversaw everybody. Each group, juniors, seniors, intermediates, all had 2 childcare workers. That's what they were called, childcare workers. So I had 2. I had a woman and I had a man. Him I'm going to mention by name because he means a lot to me. And yeah, there's a good man. His name was Mr. K. And I thank every day for that man. I tell you what, man, couldn't protect us, but tried his damnedest. The other ones, the other child care workers that I had here, the woman in the juniors and the other man, because Mr. K came with me or I went with him when I went into intermediates, but there was another man who was in the intermediates. And that woman and that man were vicious. They were cruel. I'd been beaten by the woman in my junior year. I was an effeminate boy, and she picked me out pretty fast, and she did not like that. I believe that was the driving force. I've been hit with furniture up the head. To this day, I can't have anyone go near my head or make the movement towards my head, because if anyone tries to touch me or anything, I freak out. It just triggers me. Whereas the other man was violent. I think he only got me once. I was an intermediate for 3 years, but he got me earlier on. He threw me down a set of stairs for I can't remember what it was. Yeah, he had taken me, and so I was probably 7 or 8 when he did that. 7, I believe. 6, 7. No, I would have been 8 years old. He took me and he threw me down a set of stairs. And these were big stairs.
Yeah.
There was 13 to 20 steps in between each floor. So I went down there. My mother had not lived too far away. About 2 kilometers maybe was where she was living and working. And I had run away after that. And I just went to her and I just stayed silent. And then she just looked at me and says, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And then just said, what is wrong? And I just lost it. And I told her what happened. Well, she grabbed me and cleaned me up. And then we went on the fastest walk I ever went on back to that school. And in front of everybody, she ripped that man a new one. "You ever come near my son again, I'll fucking kill you. You ever touch him again." So he never fucked with me again after that. But I watched him beat my friends stupidly. Cords, the cords of electrical appliances. Taking those off. I seen him grab people off the tops of the bunk beds, and just hearing the sickening thud of my best friend's head hitting the floor. I'm just going limp, but still being fucking beat. Just the life being beat out of him by this man, and we're standing there, standing witness to this, having not being able to do anything. So that's the childcare workers. Not all were bad. Those 2 were. But Mr. K, I just want to say, was a good man. And I was fortunate to have him as my childcare worker up until my teens, up until I think maybe the last 2 years. And then his story kind of ends with me there. But as far as Star goes, we can move into the second portion of the grooming if you want, or did you have a question?
No, I mean, I'm just I just I don't even know what to say. I think about it. My son's 7, 8, and I can't even imagine him going through that. So it's really tough to hear. And again, I thank you for sharing this, because it must be hard to talk about. But yeah, I think
sometimes it is. I don't know why, but yeah, but it is sometimes. Because when you said, when I look at my son, or if I think about my child at that time, that's when it hits me, is when I see pictures of myself when I was 6 years old, and I went, who would do that? Because I learned to take myself out of that. Somehow through a survival instinct or through a defense mechanism, I knew I could remove myself from that. So I didn't see that until I grew up and was fully groomed and fully when you don't know differently, you don't know it's wrong. You don't know it's wrong because you don't know differently. As you got older, you knew something was not right, that this was not right.
Yeah.
But this is the way things were. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
There was no, I'm going to move into the intermediate part, which
Yeah.
is when the abuse gets heavier. With Star in particular, because that's where a majority of my abuse came from.
Mm-hmm.
So I turned into an intermediate. Now, by this time, the grooming was continued as you get older with more games and more of a reward system. Your allowance was upped. He also had this room. And in the room, he had a TV. You got to remember, this is way back in the 70s, early 80s. And he had a sauna.
Mm-hmm.
He had a sit-down sauna for one. And no one can see me, so I don't know why I'm making the motions of
Yeah.
this sauna. But imagine a full-grown man sitting in a box. Now, in this box, there are room for two boys to sit in the sauna. But the game was, oh, hey, I'm good. What a reward. What fun. What a great game. This is the sauna. And there was snacks and pop and everything in this room. And the childcare workers were in the room with us there. I don't know where they were, but a group of us kids were in there. And it was fun. It was almost like an honor.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow, you got picked to go in the room and go watch TV and have these snacks. Because that's what you think of as a kid.
Yeah.
Snacks and pop and fun and games and being recognized, being seen, being acknowledged. And then full on nudity and touching, because you had to be nude to be in that sauna.
Yeah.
And so that's when he would start encouraging more hands-on touching through the towel, and he would do the same thing and walk around with a towel on his erect cock, his penis. And, I'm trying to hear it how you hear it, because for me, this is just how it was. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how it must be to your ears to hear this, especially a father with a young child. And that's kind of messing with me right now. But I'll continue with the story. From I was a intermediate for 3 years, and then I moved into a senior. I think I was starting to be, I think I was 12. Maybe I was an intermediate for 4 or 5. Is that the math? Because I think I was about 12 years old when I became a senior. And that was scary as hell. The older boys were in there. And that being said, there was also abuse from the older boys on the younger boys, because that's what they were taught. That's what they were taught. That's what they knew. And they were coming into puberty and coming into this, and it was an easy mark. So as a young guy, you were getting it from all fucking ends there. The supervisors, childcare workers, Star, and the older boys. So I became a senior, and that's when the full-on physical, like the full-on sexual assaults started happening. And that was, I don't want to say natural progression, but that seemed the way it worked. The way he did it, the way he groomed was very methodical. He was a very methodical predator. And around that time, I think it was my last year of the intermediates, I was sick one day and I had to stay home from school. And I was parched, or I needed milk or something, or I wanted something to eat because I'd woke up and I was hungry because I missed school. And around 10:30 each morning, the childcare workers would all meet down in the kitchen, in the dining room. which is where we all ate. And on this day was when I learned that they knew. They knew what was happening to us. They were making jokes about it. They were laughing about it. And that was it. There was nothing to be done.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't, why didn't you just tell somebody, is what people always ask. How come you didn't say something to somebody? Who were you going to tell?
Yeah.
Who were you going to tell? You were groomed. And Star had a very particular dialogue that could put the fear of God into you.
Mm-hmm.
That could, he had a way of saying things, or withholding and not including in the fun stuff, like
Mm-hmm.
the motorbikes. 'Cause in the seniors, there was motorbikes. There was trips, there was all sorts of things. The rewards were always there, as part of that whole structure that he had for grooming. And that was, for me personally, who was I going to tell? If they all knew and they didn't do anything about it,
Mm-hmm.
who could I tell? And
Yeah.
at that point, the shame, when you're turning into a young man, and you know what that's like, you don't want to say that you're being touched. You don't want to say that, you're losing your sense of manliness, or you lost that power. And it's a very shameful thing. So that's why we never told anybody. We internalized that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what happens there when you internalize that kind of trauma.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, the fact that you guys were almost like isolated, even though all of you kids were together, but you were isolated
Mhm.
by the staff. You really didn't have anyone other than this one person who showed you affection or bribes or prizes or rewards.
Mhm.
And it's such psychological manipulation
Oh
for
yeah,
little kids, right? Because the only person that you could trust was this person
was the
who,
man in authority, but also the
yeah,
man who was signing the checks.
yeah,
And I'll, like I said to you, my grandparents both worked at that school, and Star was also a family friend. Star was at their 50th wedding anniversary. They looked up to Star. They thought the sun rose and set on Star. Who was I going to tell?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Who was I going to say anything to? So that answers the question. Why didn't you say anything to anyone?
Yeah, no, and
But
again, sorry, go ahead.
no, I think that pretty much that is the Coles version
Yeah,
of the abuse. I don't want to get into the specifics, but let's just say the assaults were brutal, and they left their marks. Ended up getting sick, probably in grade 8, had to be hospitalized.
mm-hmm,
I witnessed my best friend try to hang himself in front of me. Yeah, just I saw some other kids committed suicide during their tenure at school. It wasn't a lot, but there was some, but not in the school, because the girls were also being abused.
mm-hmm.
I don't want to leave that out, but not by Star. The girls were being abused by another man that was a Star's second in command, a man from our own reserve, and he had abused the girls greatly. And, I remember just hearing, she killed herself. She didn't come back. You didn't know then why she killed herself,
Mm-hmm.
but in time, as you grew, you went,
Yeah, and I guess what they leave out is when they talk about 6,000 kids dying in the schools, they don't really get into the details of how these kids were dying, right? And why they were dying.
I think with that number, I think a majority of those numbers is because a lot of those kids back then had whatever illnesses came along through the school that they weren't immune to. European illnesses, TB. TB was a big killer. Was a big killer for the kids, and they would just put him in a grave, just put him in the dirt, no marker. Couldn't tell the parents because there was no way to communicate with the parents. The kids just would never. Some people just don't know whatever happened to their kids. Some died running away, frozen to death, trying to get away, running away from their abusers, trying to get home to their people, getting lost in the snow. One of the more famous stories is Charlie Wenjack. Was a sad story in Ontario, and a young boy just trying to get home, and he died. But that's just there are records, like if you go online, you hear this. The handwritten accounts they're very brief. Oh, 2 girls went swimming. Oh, they drowned. These are their names. That's it. No investigation, no everything, just another dead Indian. That's all that was. So I think that a lot of those numbers come from illness. The kids not being able to handle, I don't know, a European illness like TB, or a lot of those illnesses came from when colonization happened. Smallpox, famously smallpox, with the blankets that they handed out to the people knowingly. By the way, but I think we're getting off track. So that wraps up, I think, the abuse part, unless you wanted to delve into that further.
Well, I think, coming out of the school then, like, obviously you said the abuse continued until you were in the senior kind of bracket. And then you get out of school, and now you're back into the real world as you knew it. What was it like? And I guess, the trauma, again, it was buried, right?
Yeah, I didn't know that word. I didn't know that anything. I thought that's just how things were.
Yeah.
That was just how things were. I don't know any other better way to say it. Because I grew up with all those kids, and I knew that they were going through the same thing. So I did leave Gordon's when Star left, which I think was 83, and he didn't leave. If you go into the history of Star himself, you'll see that there was already a blueprint for this guy, even before he got to Gordon's. There was always already a record. And that is what would happen with people like Star, or even the priests or the nuns. They would, let's say they had an assault on somebody, or they had an incident. They would never say what the incident was, with a father this or brother this or whatever they were called. And they would just be transferred to another one. They weren't taken out of the system. They were just moved around to keep doing what they were doing.
Yeah.
Now Star had a history already of incidents. From what I've read, what I've seen online, because I've looked him up in recent years, and I wanted to know what happened to him.
Yeah.
I was curious, and I just lost his trail. I do want to go a little bit, maybe more into during my tenure, during my time, we did, as opposed to the earlier generations where they were taking the native away, we had power dancing in our school, which is a type of native dancing. It's how we celebrate our culture and things like that. So we would have that. And there was also cadets and a boxing club, which was Star's main. That was his main his main thing. A lot of the boys that were abused were boxers.
Mm.
But that didn't stop him from abusing anyone else. It's just because that was his particular club. And when they went on road trips, well, fuck, fair game.
Yeah.
You stayed in hotels. You're driving in cars. This is a much longer conversation. I'm sure you and I will touch on this again, the way we connected in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't want to beat a dead horse there. I think people get the point about how this grooming went in my particular case,
Mm-hmm.
and how in the generations before it was. I don't know if it was grooming or just outright violence. I do
Yeah.
know there was sexual assault. I do know there was rape. I do know that there was just genocide on a culture, on
Yeah.
a beautiful culture. Yeah,
And,
all out war on a culture.
and do you know if that was obviously like continuing, like I don't know if you know this, but continuing until the very end of when these schools got shut down, or like all forms of abuse, were they still happening after you had left?
Well, I'll tell you, yes, that there had to have been. I do know of one case of one man who did come back in my senior year, but was already a senior when I was a kid. So he came back and worked there.
Mm-hmm.
And he had, I think, become an abuser on his own, in his own right.
Well, I think the cycle continues, right? Like,
it absolutely does. Yeah,
yeah,
it absolutely does. So, yeah, whereas it was the priests and the nuns in the early days, it was our own people who grew up with a generation of parents who, I guess, thought that was normal, just took away any coping mechanism, which was one of the things they wanted to do. They just destroyed pretty much generations. Go back 100 years and go back 100 years in one family.
Yeah.
In one family. And yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but I think that's the point. Why the culture is so in such a bad state of affairs, how you see rampant suicide, you see rampant drug and alcohol abuse, you see in reserves still such extreme poverty. So in one way, they almost succeeded.
Yeah.
In destroying an entire culture. They almost succeeded.
And I guess people don't necessarily appreciate that impact, right? Because I mean, most people are like, well, like, how come this community can't get out of it? They get all these benefits, they get all this help, but it's like the perpetual cycle continues because, systematically, the kids are growing up in the same system and they're learning the same. They're getting that generational trauma passed down to them, and they're not able to.
Intergenerational trauma.
Yeah. So I think people don't really appreciate that. And until, and I guess in your case too, I mean, obviously there's still a lot of trauma there. And I don't know if you can even deal with that type of trauma, unless you're in intense therapy, but even that, I don't know, if that would.
I'll tell you how the trauma will always be there. The seeds are there. It's always going to be inside me. But I should maybe mention now that I am a recovering alcoholic. I'm 2 years and I think 16 weeks sober today. But up until that time, the trauma, that's how I dealt with it, was to numb it, to drink it away and deal with it, deal with the anger. But when I got sober in that first year, and I saw it for what it was. I saw the trauma for what it was. I accepted it. And I looked at it, and I was lucky. And to be able to have the skills or the tools to recognize it and go, there it is. Now, what are you going to do about it, Kurt? What are you going to do about it? And in my way, I forgave it. I had to forgive it. I had to forgive it. Otherwise, it was going to own me for the rest of my life. It was always going to be something that was going to destroy me. And it will if I let it.
Mm-hmm.
So I forgave it. And I'll tell you something, Ferk, I even thanked it. I said, thank you. Thank you for this journey. This is what brought me here now today, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, it does.
And then I released it. And I said, I won't let this be my prison anymore. This is where I start again.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I reclaim who I am. So in that process, in the last 2 years and 15 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever it may be, I'm reclaiming who I am, and I'm reclaiming myself as a Native man and learning who I am and what I should bring to my community.
Mm-hmm.
And there's work to do.
Yeah.
There's work to do for my people, and not only for my people, for all peoples who suffer trauma. And so that's how I dealt with the trauma of that. I just forget. I had to forgive it. I had to forgive it, or let it kill me. And
no, and I mean, that's very inspiring, and I think most people unfortunately don't get to that state, right? They let that trauma consume them, or they just try to escape it, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or even suicide. Unfortunately,
I can count on both my hands how many times I've been at the end of a rope, the end of a wire, arms cut up, pills, trying to kill the pain. This world would be better off without me. And I always joke about it. It's like, how many times can I try? I failed, I guess. And I always say, I guess I'm just not good at it. Maybe I should quit. Maybe I should just quit trying to off myself. Somehow I always survived. Someone found me, or I was getting pumped out at the hospitals, coming to with charcoal being forced down my throat. I was, if you can call that lucky, I survived all those attempts. And I'm grateful for that. And I guess in the end, that was another thing where I just said, I guess I'm here for a reason. I'm not meant to die.
Mm-hmm.
So that helped along with the recovery as well. And there's something I have to do. So I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
What I'm here to do. But there's a reason.
Yeah.
But we may have gotten off topic there.
No, I mean, I think, this is, I can't even imagine how difficult this has been for you. Like, just listening on the other end here, I've just, I'm just in complete shock. And, I think, the fact that you've been able to do all this work and be sober, it's inspiring. And, again, I want to sincerely thank you for sharing your story, because, I don't think we appreciate the difficulty that came being in those situations. And
kind of a prologue to residential school was I was violent.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how to cope with life. I didn't know. I was, to my partners, as my family, I was, so, and that continued up until the last couple of years. And I'm just learning who I truly am now that I'm sober, because I drank from the time I was 15 years old.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I My father was also an alcoholic and a pill addict. It's just we were both lucky to have survived it and found a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I keep finding new ways. Each day. I find new ways. And if I can help anybody, if this story helps anybody out there who has trauma or has been through this exact same thing, you're not alone. You're not alone in this. In any trauma, in sexual assault, be it from residential school, be it from anybody that might be listening today.
Mm-hmm.
Shame, pain, guilt, remorse. That's a fucking 4 apocalypse right there. 4 horses of apocalypse right there. Just there's help. You don't have to be lost. Wherever you are out there, know that you're not alone. Reach out for help. I've I looked for other residential school survivors, like a support group, but I just never I never found one. I got in contact with a man once, and then COVID happened, so I wasn't able to meet with him. So
Yeah.
it would be, if anybody hears this out there and knows of anything like that, a residential school survivor or support group, then then let FERC know, and he can let me know.
Yeah.
Or just comment. I mean, that'd be something I'd definitely be interested in. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the main reasons I wanted to talk about this today, was just to let people know you're not alone.
Yeah.
And that is the one thing we always think it's just us, or I can deal with it. I've handled it. Yeah, that's the biggest mistake. Until it's too late. And for some of them, I have lots of friends who are dead now. The young man who hung himself in front of me, he did survive, but he eventually succumbed to pills, overdosed, about 10 years ago. Best friend died, but he died of cancer. And if it was not for him, he was my best friend growing up. My second best friend after the other one got asked to leave the school after his suicide attempt, and he died. I know a couple of other boys that succumbed to suicide who were also in the same group. I do know of a few other guys who lived through this, but we've never had a chance to sit and talk. I think now that we're older men, I would like one day to meet these other guys that I was in school with, and just talk with them and see how they're doing. And, just know that they're not alone, just like I know that I'm not alone in this.
Yeah. And I think you touch on an important thing is, I mean, you mentioned it earlier too, but I think part of the reason why it's done in silence is because of the shame and the guilt that people feel when they even talk about it, right? And
oh yeah, it was kind of a running joke. I mean, they used to call us stars boys, those of us that were chosen. Like, not every child was chosen. He would pick a certain group out of every year that was there. And I was one of those. And they would, the other boys would call us stars boys, or make a joke out of it. So it was ingrained, like, to be ashamed, to internalize that kind of teasing. And that's that. But I'd like to say that I don't have the storybook ending. I mean, but I have so far a story to continue, and a lot of them don't have that. 6,000 is the number they put on it. Chances are there's more.
Well, and I think
all those other children that disappeared.
Well, and at the same time, the 6,000 doesn't account for everyone that's carried the trauma and dealt with it in harmful ways, right? So
yeah, no, that's just the number that they came up with.
Yeah.
That they that doesn't those children that froze to death, those children that died. I mean, It's a horrible legacy. It's a horrible legacy, and one of the reasons I did this today is because a lot of people don't know that residential schools even existed. They don't know that this happened. One of the greatest tragedy of Canadian history. A lot of people, it's not taught in school. I don't know if it is now. I don't know if it's part of the curriculum. But it definitely should be.
Again, a lot of it is what we hear in the media or through hearsay. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of accurate information out there, as you mentioned.
No.
And even the whole idea around residential schools, it's not talked about. I don't think most people even know the concept of residential schools to begin with. So even knowing the type of abuse that took place, it's far-fetched. Like, even for me, I didn't appreciate the extent of it, and I think that's part of the problem is the awareness isn't there, and we only hear one side of the story. And I think part of this is, podcast is to bring that awareness, and hopefully people can learn and have more of an appreciation, or if they can even do more to support the community, because that's what the community needs, is support, and not be judgmental. I think that's part of the other problem is there's a lot of judgment that gets passed around.
Be curious, not judgmental. Instead of being curious, train your mind to be curious, not judgmental. Everybody has a story. Everybody has pain. Everybody. So before you pass judgment, just remember that's a human being too. And I have to work on that as well. I mean, every day. I have to work on that as well. And remind myself just to be curious and learn. And we all got a lot of work to do.
For sure.
About everybody's culture. And just to bridge these divides and this ignorance. And this knowledge is key. Knowledge is the only way to...
For sure. No, and Curtis, again, I just want to thank you for doing this and sharing your story. Like I said, it must be really tough to talk about, and I'm glad you are where you are today with all the work you're doing and having that different mindset. And I'm super grateful for you to come here and have this conversation with me.
Well, that's the end of the episode. Thank you again for tuning in and showing your support. Until next week.